Now, if I ask you what you first think about when I mention hand weapons in World War II, you probably think of the trusty rifle and bayonet. Regular viewers of this channel might immediately think of the Gurkha kukri. But if I specifically mention the Commandos, then you'll probably immediately think of the Fairbairn Sykes dagger. But the Commandos also had access to another fearsome hand-to-hand combat weapon of the Second World War, and that is the SMATCHET, which is a pretty incredible weapon in itself. So why on earth did Commandos need a weapon like this? And let's find out some more about it. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, before we delve into the SMATCHET specifically, we're going to set some context, very important. And it's really important to mention at the outset that the standard weapon for most infantry, and in some cases Marines and Navy as well, of the Second World War was a bolt-action rifle. Okay, so this is a magazine rifle in most nations. So for the British, this is an SMLE, which is what we started the Second World War with, which was a First World War rifle. In fact, it predates the First World War, but we were still using it in the Second World War. And most other militaries, whether we're talking about the Italians or the Germans or the French or whoever else, started the war with bolt-action rifles. And many of us finished it with bolt-action rifles. Now, when you have a rifle at this time, the bayonet was still a surprisingly important thing, and they certainly trained bayonet fighting across all the militaries of the world. Bayonets had been rather important in World War I and in the interwar years, and were still being used extensively in World War II. And of course, in an environment where you might be storming buildings or trenches, fortifications, with a bolt-action rifle at close range, having a spiky thing on the end of your rifle is really quite useful for keeping people at bay, or simply because you haven't managed to chamber another round yet. So bayonets were still super important. And indeed, the bayonet, whilst it is usually fitted to the rifle, could be detached and used as a hand weapon. So in fact, if we look at Biddle's work, for example, with the US Marines, then he was teaching them large knife fighting based on his extensive experience. Very cool manual he made as well, using the bayonet. So using large bayonets, essentially like a Bowie knife, was a thing in World War II. And of course, there were certain specialised and in some cases sort of ethnically specific units, for example the Gurkhas, who made use of their own regional weapons. So for example, in the British Army we commonly find the Gurkha kukri being used, and not just by the Gurkhas. In fact, my own great uncle was in the Royal Engineers in Burma. In fact, two of my great uncles were in World War II, and we still have the family kukri. So he had a kukri even though he was in the Royal Engineers. Most of his soldiers were Indian. And so things like the kukri used a lot in the British Army, a little bit in other armies. But if we go over to the US Army, for example, we find things like bolo knives and even Bowie knives being used. But now we come to the very specific type of troop known as Commandos. Okay, now I'm not going to give you a potted history of the Commandos. Obviously, we've got paratroopers, we've got Royal Marines Commandos, and then later on we've got the SAS and the SBS. But the Commandos, at least in British service, and also in fairness with the American copy of this, the V42, they are famous for a certain type of dagger, which is commonly referred to as a stiletto. I'm not a big fan of this term because technically this is not really a stiletto, it's a dagger. But anyway, this is a specialised thrusting weapon. Not to say it's only thrust, and if we look at Fairbairn's own training manuals, he does also cut with it, and the edges are there for other purposes as well, but it is by and large kind of like an assassin's weapon, and that was often how it was used. Now, we've talked about these in previous videos. I have, of course, in the past done videos about kukri versus Fairbairn Sykes, and of course they're completely different things. Okay, so generally speaking, the kukri is a sort of thing that will accompany a rifle and be used to take machine gun nests by frontal charges or flanking charges and things like this, whereas the commando dagger, as you'll see from this blackened third pattern one, is often used stealthily. It's used at night, it's used for creeping up behind sentries, but it could be used in a pinch in a close-in brawl. Now, obviously, if your primary weapon is a rifle and you go into a building to clear a building, you've thrown some grenades in, but there's still some people alive in there, and you go in with your rifle either with or without the bayonet and someone jumps on you, you might find out that you're in a situation whereby the best thing you can do in that situation is to pull out whatever type of knife or dagger you have, which if you're a commando very likely will be the Fairbairn Sykes, and use that at close range in order to free yourself so that you can go back to using your firearm again. So these have a very important function in World War II. So the real question here is, I guess, if all commandos in British service and in many other militaries in the world had some form of stiletto dagger type weapon, in addition to whatever firearms they were carrying, and in many cases those firearms would have a bayonet either attached or in the hand as well, why on earth does this amazing weapon known as the SMATCHET exist? Well, we're going to get to that at the end, but first of all, let's have a look at what the SMATCHET is. So our primary source for the SMATCHET is actually Fairbairn's own manuals. Now, he supposedly designed this himself. I don't know if anybody else was involved in designing this. We'll talk about its inspirations in a second, but fundamentally it is a chop and thrust weapon which has a strap at the back and is worn on the left hand side in the same place that you might wear a sword, fundamentally. So it is a bit like a short sword, and in fact there are a couple of sources referring to it as a Roman type sword. So they very much viewed this as a small compact sword rather than a dagger. It's a very different thing to the typical FS commando dagger. So looking at the form of it, so it is dictated by having this leaf-shaped blade which is edged on the front and then edged partially on the back. Now, many sources that you read on the internet will describe this as being edged for half of the back. In fact, the ones I've seen are more like a third. Okay, so this is what we would call a false edge up here, and that's really to assist in penetration of the thrust more than cutting with the back edge. However, you could do that. So it's edged at the back for about a third and fully down the front. And you'll notice that it is a leaf shape. We'll come back to that in a second. Next up for its features, we have a guard here, which is nickel-plated steel, I believe. It's certainly plated. Some sources might refer to this as a nickel silver guard, which it's not. It's nickel plated. It's very clearly steel underneath. Could possibly be brass, but I think it's steel. So it's plated steel, and of course, why plated? Well, it stops it rusting. Then we have a hardwood grip. Now, it should be pointed out there is a earlier version of this and a later version of this. This is the earlier style one, where if I just come in close, you can see it's got multiple pin rivets through here. The later one has just two big brass ones. And then we've got a pommel, and again some of them have a brass pommel. This actually has the aluminium alloy pommel, which again is secured via rivets through the side, and a lanyard. We'll get to the lanyard in a second, through a hole in the pommel. The pommel is quite heavy, the grip is quite fat and sturdy. It's made in two halves, riveted either side of a fairly sturdy tang. But one of the important things to say about this is not as heavy as a weapon, or not as blade heavy as a weapon as you might think. It actually balances, if you have a look here, right next to the guard, which is really, really interesting because it was certainly something that was in Fairbairn's mind. If we just go over to the commando dagger, this is a very unusual dagger, this design of dagger, in that it actually balances behind the guard. Now, most historical knives and daggers balance in front of the guard, somewhere up the blade here, or at most in the guard. So the fact that this is balanced in the hand is a very specific thing that Fairbairn talks about for retention, for keeping it in your hand. It's clearly something he liked from a knife and comes from his time in the Shanghai Municipal Police, getting into knife and pistol fights with hoodlums as a policeman in Shanghai for a couple of decades before the Second World War. So when we come to this SMATCHET, this is not exactly like a machete or a billhook in terms of how it feels in the hand. In fact, although it looks like a very big blade, the blade is actually quite thin and is distally tapered. So it comes down to maybe 1.5 millimeters at the tip, and it is only around maybe 4 millimeters at the base here. So it's actually, although it's very broad, it's really, really thin. So don't for a second think that it is, I just happen to have a World War II billhook here. This is primarily a tool. Now, could this be used as a weapon? Of course. Anything can be used as a weapon, from a kitchen knife to a rolling pin to a broom handle to a chair. Anything can be used as a weapon by the determined enough. But the billhook, which this one's actually dated to 1943 and is a military one, this is primarily for cutting wood and brush and stuff like this. It is a tool. Yes, you could use it as a weapon. And while you might think that the billhook superficially looks similar in size and perhaps weight to the SMATCHET, in reality, they're nothing alike. The SMATCHET is very light bladed, more like a machete, or what I think it's based on, a barong. So here we get into challenging some of the, I would regard them as misconceptions of this. There are many sources in books and on the internet that regard this as being based on various things that went before it. One of those things is the Welsh trench fighting sword of World War I, used by the Welsh Fusiliers, I think it was. I don't think it's based on that. It's very different size, different shape. It doesn't have the same blade cross-section at all, different kind of thing. Although Fairbairn probably was aware of them. I don't think this is particularly based on, some people say, on the bolo either. I think this is specifically based on the Filipino barong, okay, which was one of the main weapons used by the Moros during, for example, the Filipino-USA war in around 1900. So I think this is absolutely based on barong. But, of course, it has the addition of a guard, which is a very European thing to do, and means that, as a thrusting weapon, it's now much safer to use, because the hand can't ride up onto the blade as it could do with some Filipino designs. And very importantly, the pommel. We'll get to the use of the pommel in a second, but this is a very heavy pommel, and that is for a reason, and it has a specific purpose. So let's see, what does Fairbairn actually say about using this thing? So we're very lucky, as well as a few films, for example, that have been filmed of Fairbairn actually training people both in America and over here in the UK, particularly in Scotland. We're very lucky to have a series of manuals from Fairbairn which teach all sorts of things, including commando combat, but even for women in self-defense and even for shooting styles to be used by police. So, as I mentioned, he had been very prominent in the Shanghai Municipal Police, and he'd been involved in shooting and knife combat and everything else for many, many years, and this was why he was recruited in World War II to train soldiers. And what I've got here is a compendium of his works, the two principal ones relating to the SMATCHET being called Get Tough and All In Fighting. Now, just before we delve into what he says about the use of the SMATCHET, its name. What on earth does SMATCHET mean? So again, I've seen lots of explanations online and in written books about the word SMATCHET, and most people conclude that it's a combination of the word machete and hatchet. Do I think that's correct? I think it's partially correct, but in my researches I found an interesting nugget of information. And now, William Fairbairn was Scottish. He was the youngest of 14 children born to a very poor working class family in Scotland, and in old Scottish slang, a SMATCHET was a naughty child or small person. Now, I do think that when he named this the SMATCHET, he must have been aware of that, and so I suspect that yes, while the word is related to machete and hatchet, I'm not disputing that. I think the fact that he probably brought a smirk to his face to know that a SMATCHET was also a rambunctious and naughty little child, which I think is a little bit what this weapon is like. But anyway, let's see what he says in his book. So first thing to say is that Fairbairn doesn't give a huge amount of detail about the SMATCHET. It's supposed to cost 3 pages, but there's not an awful lot on those pages. So here you can see some pictures of the SMATCHET being worn and held. We'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, he begins, the SMATCHET, which is spelt in a couple of different ways, but anyway, the SMATCHET, the psychological reaction of any man when he first takes the SMATCHET in hand, is full justification for its recommendation as a fighting weapon. I understand what he's saying, hopefully you will do as well. In other words, it gives someone confidence, much like the kukri or having a knife on your belt. If your job is to storm into a building or take ground and capture a trench, then having something on your in your hand or on your belt which makes you feel confident is a very useful thing for a soldier. He will immediately register all the essential qualities of a good soldier: confidence, determination, and aggressiveness. Its balance, weight, and killing power with the point, edge, or pommel, we'll get to that in a second, combined with the extremely simple training necessary to become efficient in its use, make it an ideal personal weapon for all those not armed with the rifle and bayonet. We'll come back to that point at the end. So he then goes on talking about carrying and drawing it. I've already told you about carrying it and wearing it. So it's worn down on the left-hand side in the same place you would have a sword. And now we finally get to the lanyard. So you put your hand through and hold it there. And this is how he shows it being held. And he specifically says to hold it as near to the top, in other words, as close to the point of balance of the grip as possible. So you don't hold it down here. Personally, if I was doing Bowie knife dueling, for example, which is something we do in my club, I would actually hold it down and I'd put my thumb up the back, but that's not what Fairbairn wants. What Fairbairn wants is a good solid hammer grip right the way up at the top by the guard with the lanyard around the wrist. So this is a weapon which is very securely, firmly and determinedly held in a way that you can't drop or lose it. Moreover, having the lanyard around here means that technically you can drop it and operate a rifle or do something else, open a door, whatever you need to do, and you can easily get it back into your hand again. So the modes of attack with the SMATCHET are described very clearly, concisely, and they're quite basic in the manual. So number one, you can either drive the point into the stomach as shown there. So a thrust to the middle of the body, dead easy. Number two is a saber cut, as he calls it, to the right low neck, okay? And the next one is a cut to the low left of neck. So what he's talking about here is chopping down onto the side of the neck. Bear in mind that your enemy Nazi here is wearing a helmet, and they have a chin strap, and they've got a high collar. So actually down here is above the level of the uniform, but below the level of the helmet. And you've got to bear in mind the equipment that's being worn in relation to where the attacks are being given. In addition to this, Fairbairn gives a lot of information about the placement of arteries, and it should be fairly obvious why necks are a very vulnerable target. And four, smash up with the pommel under the chin. So essentially, and other people have done videos about this online, so I won't go into a huge amount of depth. We've got the thing here. We've essentially got the thrust to the stomach. We've got a chop down to one side. We've got a chop down to the other side. And then we've got the ram up with the pommel here. So for very simple attacks, in fact, it's quite like some of the cutlass material we'll see in the Victorian period. It might be related to it. So you've got chops here, stab here, pommel here. And you can imagine in any of these positions or situations, depending on what you're doing and when you go into, say, storm a trench or something, this weapon might be in a position that dictates which attack comes first. If your hand is low, then you might come up with the pommel to make space, and then you might come down with the chop, for example. It's just one example. So, a fairly simple but also very brutal weapon. Now, the only additional subtlety that Fairbairn gives is actually looking at chopping of arms. He looks at the wrist and he also looks at the inside of the elbow. And again, this relates to his wider work where he talks about arterial attacks with any type of knife, really. And you've got to bear in mind as well that your opponent isn't going to be standing there unarmed in a World War II scenario. They're usually going to be holding a rifle. So very often the arms will be, if you come on this side, you'll get a chop there. If you're on this side, you'll get a chop there. So very often these attacks at the arms are dictated by what the opponent's holding and where they're holding it. So let's just come back to that little part of a sentence where Fairbairn says, this is a perfect weapon for those not armed with a rifle and bayonet. Now, I've noticed, looking around both on the internet and also in published books, that a lot of people take this to mean this is a great weapon for someone who isn't armed. Now, it's very clear, actually, when you start researching it, that this isn't the case. This isn't what he meant. I'll go into what he meant in a second with the thanks to a newspaper source that I found while researching this. Now, obviously, most soldiers, whether you're a commando or anyone else at this time, are going to have a rifle and bayonet. Okay, so if that's the standard armament of most commandos, also of most Wehrmacht or Italian or Axis French or whatever soldiers that you're coming up against, that's the standard armament. However, not all soldiers, particularly as we go later in the war, not all soldiers are actually armed with a rifle and bayonet. Some people are armed with other things. So this really comes back to answer the question of why would you have a SMATCHET? If you've got a rifle and bayonet and you've got a commando dagger, why on earth would you want a SMATCHET? Well, this newspaper extract actually gives us the answer. So this is taken from the Sunday Post of Sunday the 20th of February 1944. And it's a commando describing how him and his group of men were captured by the Germans. And the article is titled "Shot in Cold Blood." It says, after about 20 minutes, 3 German SS Polizei soldiers advanced and covered us with their machine pistols, shouting, "Heraus, heraus!" They adopted a most menacing attitude. The soldier with me stood with his hands up. He was shot dead from a range of 1 yard by all 3 men. Luckily, I could not move and they carried me to a French cafe where I was left under guard with several wounded commando soldiers. So it says a number of German soldiers entered the cafe with SMATCHETs, there we go, long knives used by our Tommy gunners in lieu of bayonets. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. They began to abuse me, calling us Schweinhund Engländer, and made as if to slash us with the SMATCHETs, but some of the others prevented them from doing so. Now, obviously it goes on, I won't read the whole account, but there it explicitly states in February 1944 that the SMATCHETs are long knives used by our Tommy gunners in lieu of bayonets. So really there's the answer to the question. And I haven't seen anywhere published this before, that this was the reason that they were carried. This is a large assault weapon, akin to a kukri, or indeed akin to a bayonet on the end of a rifle. It's not comparable and doesn't take the place of the commando dagger. If you were in the commandos, you'd have one of these and a SMATCHET. If you didn't have, and again this is explicitly from the newspaper source, if you didn't have a rifle and bayonet. Why? Well, quite simply, the bayonet fits on the end of the rifle. In this case, SMLE, short magazine Lee Enfield, later on the number 4 with the pig sticker bayonet. So if you have a rifle, you have a bayonet on the end, and that's what you charge into a trench or into a building with primarily. You don't charge in waving around one of these FS daggers, because that's really for shanking people at very close range when you're sneaking up on them. But if you don't have a rifle, if you have a Tommy gun, and we'll come back to that in a second, then you need a hand weapon, because yes, you could just hit someone with your Tommy gun, but it's not a very good hand weapon. It's far more effective to have something that's actually made as an effective hand weapon, like a Bowie knife, a machete, a billhook, a kukri, or a SMATCHET. So this is what commandos were given if they didn't have the rifle and bayonet. Now, why didn't all of them have the rifle and bayonet? Well, quite simply, within the squads of soldiers, whether it was commandos or any other soldiers at this time, some people's job was to not have a bolt-action rifle, but was to have a submachine gun. Now, you can't fit a bayonet to a Thompson submachine gun, at least not usually. Later on, there are certain types of submachine gun you can fit bayonets to, and probably in those cases, they therefore no longer need the SMATCHET. But if your primary armament is a Tommy gun, a Thompson submachine gun, or perhaps even a pistol in some cases if you're an officer, then you need something as a hand weapon because you don't have a bayonet on the end of your rifle. This would also go perhaps for light machine gunners, people with Bren guns, perhaps people operating mortars. So now we come back to this specific SMATCHET. Now, I'm in the process of researching this because I actually know who owned this during World War II. And it was actually owned by someone who was in the Army Service Corps, who was initially a driver, but was later on with the Long Range Desert Group. Okay, so essentially with the precursors of what became the SAS. So it's very interesting that he ended up with this. He owned this all the way until his death, since he served in World War II. So I suspect that these SMATCHETs ended up in the hands of people who weren't even necessarily commandos, but people who weren't carrying around a rifle and bayonet because they had another job to do, whether it was operating a vehicle, probably in that case, or whether it was someone who had a Tommy gun instead of a rifle with a bayonet on the end. So there we go. I hope I've answered a few points about the SMATCHET. Other people in the past have looked at how these were used and the origin of them, the fact that they were designed by Fairbairn, much like the more famous commando dagger. But it's great, I think, that these should get more love. But I think what I've hopefully covered in this video are a couple of points. Its name, the fact that SMATCHET is old Scottish slang for a naughty child, which I don't think is a coincidence. But in addition, the fact that these were specifically carried by Tommy gunners or people who didn't have the rifle and bayonet. So it wasn't that they were otherwise unarmed. It was just that you needed a essentially assault weapon for going straight into combat. You needed something pointy on the end, and really a little commando dagger doesn't quite cut the mustard for that, but something bigger like a kukri or a SMATCHET does. So there we go. Hopefully you now have been introduced to the SMATCHET and a little bit of its history. Had you ever heard of the SMATCHET? Post down below. I'm really curious to know. I think in Britain they're probably, or in the British Empire, you know, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, I think they're probably more widely known than outside. If you're American or perhaps German or French, did you know about the SMATCHET? Did you learn something in this video? I hope you did, and I hope you enjoyed watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and hopefully my cold will clear up soon. I know some people will ask about my voice. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.